Hey guys, and welcome back to Second Sky Gaming. So today we're going to be doing something new on the channel, which is a intro to narrative series. So this is the first episode of this narrative series. The goals for this in general are: one, get a solid foundation in narrative theory so that we can critically approach narratives in gaming, and then relatedly also amass a sort of toolkit that we can use for analyzing narratives in gaming, but also for creating narratives. So the idea is, as we go on, we'll try to build this toolkit and we'll keep kind of coming back to it as we look at different examples. So I'll be using this Cambridge Introduction to Narrative by H. Porter Abbott. It's pretty much just what came up when I searched for intro to narrative theory. So I found a couple. We're going to start with this Cambridge Introduction, and I would highly recommend, if you're going to stick around for this, to pick yourself up a copy, and we can step chapter by chapter. I think each episode will roughly be one chapter of the book, and then my plan is, after every episode, or at the end of every episode, to add a case study of a video game. Overall recap is, I'm going to go chapter by chapter through this Cambridge Introduction to Narrative. I'm going to kind of summarize my key takeaways, extract the key concepts, start building a toolkit that we can use in analyzing narratives, and then I'll end each video with a case study. And they'll just be quick, 5-10 minutes. We'll see. You'll see at the end of this one what it looks like. But let's just kind of dive in to what we're getting at here. Chapter 1, why narrative matters. That's my own heading, but this is what I got from Abbott's chapter 1. It's really deciding why narrative matters. And I think that's a good place to start, because before we go in and dive into, the defining narrative or sort of the bedrock definitions, we kind of have to think, what is it that makes narrative special? What is it that makes us care about it, right? So Abbott gives us two specific points, really. He outlines 2 points that answer the question of why narrative matters. So the first one is narrative is universal. And the second one is narrative is fundamental to human perception. So we're going to take these in turn. We'll start with narrative is universal. Abbott argues that narrative is sort of intrinsically human. You can see the quote up there. He kind of argues that it's this intrinsic human quality that underlines or showcases its universality. And obviously that sounds a little circular, but I think this quote is a good place to start. It is something that we seem to be sort of hardwired to create. As soon as we have words that come out of our mouths, it's usually creating a sort of narrative, even if that narrative is just what we want, right? I do really like this quote here. I'm just gonna vanish for a second so you can see its source. This is something that Abbott highlights, but caring nothing for the division between good and bad literature, narrative is international, transhistorical, transcultural. It is simply there, like life itself. So I think that is actually a good argument for why narrative is universal. Or it's not really an argument, it's really just sort of showcasing its universality. I do think that, putting aside language barriers, cultures, any other differences, even if you've never been able to read a book, or you can't read, or whatever it is, we're steeped in narrative, right? We're steeped in events that take place over time, and we seek to sort of understand them, or at least to communicate them. So that brings us to this second point of the two that Abbott sort of laid forth, and that being narrative is fundamental to human perception. So Abbott sort of argues that, and we'll put up another quote in here, and I will read it this time. Wherever we look in this world, we seek to grasp what we see, not just in space, but in time as well. So I think this is actually a pretty good observation. Whenever we see, like, let's say we see someone on the street, right? And let's say they're at a bus stop. we usually don't just take a look at that and or take a look at this person and melt away all other sort of context, right? We usually look at them not in just space, but time as well. We have an understanding that they likely came to that bus stop in some manner, likely walked there, right? Or maybe rode a bike, but they didn't just, appear all of a sudden right next to the bus stop. And we also have an idea of what's to come next in time, which is likely when a bus comes, they will get on it, right? So Abbott argues that we sort of take a look at the world and we match narrative with our perception, and the two sort of feed into each other. This brings us to our first sort of term that we're gonna land on here, and that is a really complicated term, narrative perception. Yeah, narrative perception. It makes sense, okay? So it's just this idea again, and Abbott sort of summarizes it here. When we look at something, we look at it not in space, but in time as well. And that is the idea of narrative perception. Abbott kind of goes in further here and does some positing on sort of the psychological underpinnings of this. Again, argues that this is something that's sort of hardwired into us, similar to maybe our capacity for grammar. And I think that's an interesting thought. But I didn't want to dive into it too much, too fast. So I will keep going here. Let's go into narrative perception. So another way we can think about narrative perception is that narrative is the main method in which we organize our understanding of time. So before we were thinking about if we have something in space, how do we understand it? But here kind of flips it slightly. It's still the same concept, but we can't really understand time without creating a narrative. And by the same extension, we can't understand an object in time or a person in time without creating a narrative. So here, though, there are two types of time that we need to consider. So now we're starting to build a couple more terms here that are important. First one is clock time, and the second one is narrative time. I'm going to throw out definitions for these right now, and it's going to make absolutely no sense. But we'll come back to it and we'll kind of touch down onto it. So clock time is really more of our usual concept of time as it relates to itself in terms of numbers, seconds, and minutes. So 30 minutes of clock time, right? Whatever happens over that time, it happens over 30 minutes, right? It's constrained by regular intervals. It's just 30 minutes of time. It's the way that we know time as we colloquially use that term. It's just time. Narrative time is going to be a little bit harder to nail down, but it's time in relation to events or incidents, and it's unconstrained by regular interval. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now, likely, and I think it's best to follow Abbott's demonstration here. It's actually very helpful and will kind of lay the groundwork for clock versus narrative time. So first, we're going to start with two narratives and we're going to look at the differences, and hopefully that's going to help us understand clock versus narrative time. Narrative one, the child fell down. After a while, she got up and ran until at last, seeing her mother, she burst into tears. "I fell down," she cried. "There, there," said her mother. "That must have hurt." Okay, so we've got a very simple narrative about a child falling down and going to her mother for comfort. Okay, let's look at a second narrative. The child fell down, sat where she had fallen, her eyes frightened, her lower lip trembling. She rubbed her knee. Was it bleeding? No, but the skin was scraped. Where was her mother? Carefully, she got to her feet and started running. "There, there," said her mother. "That must have hurt." Okay, so hopefully we can see what's going on here. Now, I'm going to highlight these because this is to say the clock time between these two narratives is the same. It starts with the child fell down and it ends with her mother consoling her. So we can put a time to that. Let's say this whole thing happened in a minute between when she fell down and then she went to her mother and said, "I fell down." So both narratives have that same time. But in the second narrative, we can see that there's an elongation of the narrative time. So this shows a manipulation, not of clock time, but of narrative time. We're spending a lot more time in the moments right after the child fell down and all these sort of internal machinations. And that shows us expanding narrative time without touching clock time. So again, narrative time is kind of event to event, but it's not constrained by how much clock time. We could have an indefinite time basically of narrative. In this 1 minute interval, we could write, a full book if we wanted to. It would probably be a pretty bad book, but the narrative time could expand exponentially, while the clock time always starts and ends with the child falling down and going to her mother. So this is the big difference between clock versus narrative time. Let's go to this another comparison of two narratives. So let's think we have narrative 2 again, the one that we just looked at. And then let's look at narrative 3, and let's pretend narrative 3 was preceded by narrative 2, and then it continued like this. In the following months, the child fell often, but slowly she acquired confidence and eventually stopped falling altogether. Indeed, as a young woman, the assurance of her gait would command attention whenever she entered a room full of people who would have found it hard to imagine that this was once a little girl who fell down all the time. Okay, so again, now instead of manipulating narrative time here, narrative 3 is expanding clock time. I mean, she's a full-on adult now, right? And people are reminiscing. Well, she's reminiscing that no one would understand that she used to fall all the time. So you can see how clock time and narrative time can be manipulated under this banner of sort of narrative perception. But it's not the case that narrative time is completely isolated from clock time. Like if we take this in the following months, we see that narrative time still uses clock time to kind of move it forward, move it back, manipulate it as it might be. They're intertwined, obviously, but there is a distinct quality between clock time, which is, a regular interval. Every single story has a clock time, right? It has to exist in some sort of timeline, right? And every story will have a narrative time I add as recounted or as thought of or whatever it might be as read. But there's no set rule on how long that has to be, right? We could cover an hour's worth of event in half a page. We could cover 1,000 years worth of event in half a page, right? And that is clock time greatly differs, narrative time the same, whereas you can do the inverse too. So you can see how both of these can be sort of manipulated as we use clock and narrative time. One last idea in this first chapter before we kind of wrap up, which is, let's go back to this quote. Wherever we look in this world, we seek to grasp what we see, not just in space, but in time as well. Okay, so we have that. Then let's look at the sort of flip side of this observation. Without understanding the narrative, we often feel that we don't understand what we see. So we do use narrative to understand what we see, but if we can't understand the narrative, it often means we can't understand what we're seeing. And I think this goes best with another one of Abbott's demonstrations, which is, let's take a look at this picture here and think about narrative perception. Okay, I'm actually gonna vanish here so you can see the whole picture. Okay, we're looking at a picture here. It's a shipwreck, right? We immediately start to understand what we're looking at. We immediately see that there was likely some water in this valley and there's no longer water there, right? We see some remnants of the water. We see that this boat was either struck or sunk or something and was likely underwater since it's so rusted or under a lot of rain. There's a lot of things that starts to come to our mind here narratively that allows us to understand what we're looking at. Now let's take a look at another photo, a painting this time, and try to put together what we're seeing. I'll try my best, but all right. Immediately, I think there's a man pounding on a mat, maybe, but the more I look at this painting, the less I feel I understand it. And I think, again, this comes from the fact that I can't really create a narrative around it. We have some sort of surface, we have some sort of body, there's an arrow. Is that a head? What's the second circle on his body? Are we in an octagon? There's just so much, and a frustration of narrative here that makes it hard to understand what exactly I'm looking at. So this is something that Abbott recognizes, and specifically, observes that artists and storytellers often will deliberately arouse and then refuse to satisfy our sort of narrative perceptions, right? And this is another term that we will kind of keep in our back pockets, which is narrative jamming. So we have narrative perception, which is what we always try to do when we see a scene, when we take in a book, just any sort of observation, which is we use narrative to try to understand what we're seeing. And then the flip side being narrative jamming is where the narrative is so frustrated that we have a hard time understanding what we're seeing. It's at this point that I'd want to make what I'm going to call the narrative theory toolkit. So we'll do a quick recap by putting together the tools in our toolkit. So let's look at sort of the terms that I've highlighted. Narrative perception, obviously, clock time, narrative time, and narrative jamming. Just four. Not a very complicated chapter. I don't know how complicated it'll get in the future, but I basically just want to take all of these and try to sort of fit them together in a manner that makes sense and I can move forward with it. So let's start with narrative perception. I kind of couch it under what I'm going to call the utility of narrative, which again sort of underlies where we started, which is why does narrative matter, right? I think the utility of narrative is demonstrated by narrative perception. Again, that concept that we seek to understand the world by looking in space and time, right? By creating narratives. And underneath narrative perception, I think we can say that it involves both clock time and narrative time. And on the flip side of that, I would say narrative perception is frustrated by narrative jamming. So here we are. We've got the whole narrative theory toolkit so far. This is something that we'll try to expand as we go, but this is just what we've covered today. Now that we have our toolkit, I want to go into our first case study, which will be Ori and the Blind Forest. Now, sometimes I'll talk through the case studies and give commentary, but here I'll be playing with just no face cam, so you can focus on the narrative itself and the application of the toolkit. I may throw the toolkit in the corner as a sort of primer, but I think the most interesting aspect is to pay attention to the use of clock time and narrative time, kind of how it ebbs and flows and how it's ultimately sort of manipulated to draw you into the game. So I hope by the end of this, you'll feel you've learned something new or interesting, and that you'll stick around for more episodes to come. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and what, if anything, was helpful or could be improved. And I'd really love to hear how you're finding the series going forward. All right, let's get into it. Ori and the Blind Forest.
Sing for Santa. Sony Chukwa. Shinji Kwata Iwa. Sin Quad, Sin Quado. Sin Quadabum Son. Trinquoda Pindos. Dosh Ror Pinquada. Filius Martiquasta.